I am a firm believer that all works of art created by the human mind can and should be critiqued. After all, they are products of flawed and imperfect people. That holds true for the Norse God of War games, a franchise which I have spent over 6 hours publicly praising for all the internet to see. God of War Ragnarok in particular has some significant flaws in terms of its pacing vis-a-vis its character development. Several moments, such as Thrud begging Thor to put down the mead for his family's sake, or Kratos telling Atreus that he has become a warrior worthy of his namesake, were not, if you ask me, built up to enough. The game, largely due to its vast scope and cast of characters, did not earn those heartfelt moments as well as it could have. And there are plenty of other criticisms you could throw at these games. Low-level enemies are absolute sponges on higher difficulties, which is rather immersion-breaking. The NPCs in Ragnarok will shout out unprompted hints at you if you so much as pause to sneeze while solving a puzzle.
I gotta get behind it. But how?
And, well, there's whatever the hell Ironwood was, but the main reason that I see for people rejecting these games, particularly Ragnarok, out of hand, is that the developers emasculated Kratos, or ruined him in some other similar fashion, which, no, they did not. I don't think that there can be any doubt that this new Kratos is decidedly more mature than he was back when butchering Greek gods was his favorite pastime. After all, adults act, or are supposed to act, based on reasoning. They are capable of using logic to make rational decisions. They govern themselves, and do not let their emotions rule them. Children, on the other hand, are largely incapable of not acting as their strongest emotion urges them to act. And I don't know who needs to hear this, but guys, anger is an emotion too. Kratos in the original trilogy is driven almost entirely by his rage, his lust for vengeance, and his vain hope to end his perpetual nightmares. He is mentally extremely immature and childish. A shining example of masculinity, he most certainly is not. Men and women are not opposites in the same way that hot and cold are. There is no virtue or vice that is unique to one gender or the other. How we express those traits tends to vary greatly, however, and the differences between men and women are quite real and should be acknowledged and appreciated. But asking if a particular behavior is masculine or feminine is very rarely helpful. Rather, we should usually ask, is this virtuous? Is this mature? Am I thinking with the mind of a man and not of a boy? Kratos slaughtering all of Olympus for daring to repeatedly deceive and betray him is not any more masculine than a woman accumulating great wealth as the world's most popular prostitute is feminine. Warmongering and senseless violence is nearly, if not totally, the domain of men, just as selling one's body for money is almost always done by women. A character who takes what he wants regardless of the cost is instead merely a child, ruled by his strongest emotions. Now, that's not to say that OG Kratos was not a well-written character, however. After all, he lives inside the world of Greek mythology, which is, by and large, a collection of cautionary tales regarding every kind of vice imaginable. And the very first time we ever see this character, he is yeeting himself off of a cliffside. Kratos avenged his family by killing the god who, through him, caused their deaths, but that vengeance left him unsatisfied, empty, and purposeless. Hence why, even after Athena saved his life and instated him in Ares' place, Kratos just went off to war again, got in trouble with Zeus, and then finally decided, screw it, all those Olympian bastards need to go. And upon accomplishing that goal, and seeing the cost that all of Greece paid, Kratos runs himself through. Though there's a bit more nuance this time, as his intention is not just to end his own suffering, but rather to prevent Athena from obtaining more power, and instead releasing the power of hope, as the game calls it, back to mankind. All that to say, Kratos couldn't really be emasculated, because he wasn't much of a man to begin with. He was a great character, an unparalleled warrior unmatched in ferocity and tenacity, but without proper regulation of those traits, he was more animal than man. But it's important to remember why he ended up that way. Without his family, without their untimely end, Kratos would never have become the force of nature that tore down Olympus. So, of course, when we meet him again in the forests of Midgard, he has a new family. Lacking any other purpose, of course he would try, albeit somewhat hesitantly, to rebuild what he had lost. I'm not going to spend much time on the first Norse game, mostly because the complaints tend to be about Ragnarok. Even the creator of the Kratos character, David Jaffe, praised the 2018 game.
I do like the first one that Corey did, but that was because it was so meta and so interesting and genuinely just so good that I was cool with it.
Funnily enough, he commented, kind of criticized how he didn't think the Kratos character would work as well without the original trilogy, which of course it wouldn't. The Norse games build beautifully on the Greek ones. Kratos becoming more stoic, learning to master his emotions and doing his best to not screw everything up all over again is an incredibly natural progression for the character. But again, I'm not really going to cover that game in this video. And although I covered Ragnarok's story far more extensively, what I didn't directly address in that insanely long video were the various charges leveled against Kratos regarding him going soft. The first and foremost of such grievances is that Kratos is too easy on Atreus, that he lets the kid walk all over him, and that his son is the real driving force in the game's story. Now, to some respect, I do agree on that last point. Atreus is more central to the plot moving forward than Kratos is, without a doubt. Atreus is the one obsessed with prophecy and destiny, so of course he ends up on center stage in a mythological tale. And there are moments that don't feel quite as earned as the writers think they are. This one, for example.
See what I can do when you trust me?
Yeah, you had one good plan, Atreus, after having one disastrous plan 10 minutes ago. The resolution of the conflict between father and son, or at least the tail end of that conflict in Helheim, is a bit rushed.
You have grown into a warrior, worthy of your namesake.
But did everyone else forget the rest of this conversation? Did we wipe from our minds the moments where Atreus confesses that without Kratos' guiding hand, he becomes a rash, blundering, overconfident moron? And beyond that, throughout the rest of the game, Kratos tends to be quite demanding of Atreus.
You did not do anything. They overcame you. That is why we must not abandon your training. It is not your competence that is in question.
Okay, but what does that mean?
Consider your intent. I am counting on you. To be safe, to be smart.
But
Use the judgment of a man and not of a child. You must choose who you are going to be. Are you going to continue to lie and keep things from me? Or are you my son?
the only way that
You are Atreus. My son. And nothing more.
Sure, he does regret some of those words later, but the majority of his advice rings true. Kratos' major arc in this game is learning how to let go. Atreus is growing up, which means he will have to make his own decisions about life, the universe, and everything. Kratos going along with Atreus on the kid's excursion in the early game is hardly out of any failure of masculinity. It's mostly because Kratos simply doesn't know what else to do. In case you haven't noticed, Kratos isn't the best decision maker. He tends to let others set the boundaries for his quests now, and he does his best to fulfill said missions while maintaining control of himself and acting as he sees fit. That is, acting justly and virtuously while protecting those whom he loves. When Kratos did trust himself to make the big decisions, well,
Such chaos.
being a good father, a strong example of masculinity to one's child, cannot mean being demanding and oppressive.
I am your father. Take the hammer and kill who I tell you to kill.
Every father must come face to face with the reality that his child will realize that he is not a perfect man. Forcefully exerting your will in every situation and heedlessly butting heads in your determination to be right will only serve to strain the relationship between parent and child to the breaking point. You might be right. Goodness knows Kratos usually was, but mistakes are a part of life, and kids need to be allowed to make them. Sometimes even when the parent knows better. Letting go, even when you know you are in the right, is not necessarily a weakness. It is often wisdom. Assuming, of course, that you as a parent have carefully judged which battles need to be fought and which hills you need not die on. Parenting is complex, especially as children age, mature, and gain willfulness and self-determination. It's easy to point at a given moment where a father relents and call him weak or emasculated, but that is quite simply missing the forest for the trees. The transition from parenting a practically helpless young child who must be protected and directed at every turn to parenting a headstrong teenager who is in fact capable and, to some degree, responsible is a rough one. The parent who experiences that shift will make mistakes, will cling to their child too tightly at times, and at others perhaps will let go when he should not have. Such is life. But at the end of that road, there comes the realization that the parent, that Kratos, cannot make Atreus' decisions for him. Hence, Kratos giving his son the final choice over whether or not to use the mask.
Atreus, you have carried it. What do you think?
That is not a weakness on Kratos' part. It is, in fact, a great strength. One of the greatest accomplishments of parents is found in giving their child the wisdom and prudence to make sound and well-reasoned decisions. When Kratos trusts Atreus to make this crucial, potentially world-altering decision, it is because he finally trusts himself, trusts the lessons that he has imparted to his son, and thus has confidence that Atreus will do what is right when the time comes. Kratos was quite clear about his distrust of this mask.
This mask. The easy answers that it promises. I know this. Shortcuts always have a price.
Without those words from his father, Atreus would never have done this.
No! No! No!
But that's enough about Atreus. Let's move on to some of the other complaints regarding Kratos' lack of testosterone, starting with his relationship with Freya. Some have complained that Kratos loses to Freya once he realizes that she is in fact the Valkyrie he has been fighting. It's pretty obvious that he lets her gain the upper hand in their duel for one thing, so it's not as if the writers had her kick his ass while he was trying his hardest. But you might say that the very fact that he let her win means that he's a big ol' wuss now. Old Kratos would have ripped her in half. I mean, yeah, he might have, so what? Which is more difficult? Which is more masculine? Letting your passions drive you into a murderous rage, giving in to your bloodlust and killing the woman who saved your son's life, or reining in your emotions, controlling yourself, forcing yourself to hold back because you don't want to repeat the mistakes of your past. In this scene and throughout his time with Freya, Kratos is very, very clearly the more mature one in the relationship. Yes, she berates him, she is in pain, and he is a source of that pain. Not the true source, but the most readily available one at which she can lash out. It's quite obvious during their journey through Vanaheim that Freya has some serious growing to do in terms of emotional maturity, while Kratos has already undergone that journey. He is the one offering advice and counsel.
This anger you feel for your brother, I know it well. His anger poisoned him against me. But I never stopped loving my brother.
Since, after all, he has been down the road on which she is still intent on traveling.
I paid back their blood 1,000 times and burned Olympus to the ground. Yet, the guilt remained. Perhaps you will kill me, Freya, but it will bring you no peace.
I think there's a sensitivity among audiences these days, one that causes them to react strongly and negatively to any story that depicts a strong women type berating or otherwise conflicting with a male character. Modern Hollywood's obsession with female leads who are right nearly all the time, especially when clashing with a Y chromosome, has, if you ask me, caused this sensitivity. And while I despise self-glorifying female protagonists who are really just toxic men with breasts as much as the next guy, and I have proof, I can say with utmost confidence that, yeah, that's just not what Freya is. She's not there to tear down Kratos, to make him feel bad for what he did, which he doesn't.
I do not regret saving your life, and never will.
Or to emasculate him in any way. If anything, she's there to highlight how he has grown in wisdom and temperance, even in just the last few years.
Can you please just shut up and kill things?
Do not tell me to kill again.
What?
I killed to protect my son, to aid my friends. But I will be no one's monster. Never again.
You don't get to make that choice. Not with the debt you owe me.
I am not here for debts. I would always have helped you.
Freya makes Kratos look better, not worse. Because of her struggles, vices, and pain, we can see just how awesome Kratos is now. And I mean that in the original sense of the word. He inspires awe. He is a man of great character, strength, and prudence, even an archetype of stoic masculinity. Okay, but what about Faye? Ragnarok's story shows that a lot of Kratos' mantras and wisdom come from his wife. First off, let me take a tangent real quick. Apparently the phrase "be better" is leftist coded or something like that, because it gets thrown at young men, particularly lonely young men, whenever they express any kind of problem nowadays. So when people hear it, they assume that the person saying it doesn't really care about their issues or their well-being. But that flippant use is a perversion of the phrase "be better." The idea that all you can change in this life is yourself is not a new one, and honestly, it's not one remotely associated with socially liberal politics that, in theory, seek to lift up the helpless and aid the victims in societies. Don't assume, just because you've heard someone say the same words which you've heard being used dismissively or aggressively by someone else, that both speakers are of one mind. Context matters. The relationship between speaker and listener matters. If some random chick smugly replies, "Be better," to a man on Twitter who is airing his grievances regarding the dating scene or whatever, that is not remotely the same as a wife telling her husband,
"We must be better."
No character who experiences a meaningful redemption arc ever completes that journey on his own. Zuko had Iroh to repeatedly and persistently give him wise counsel. Tony Stark had the selfless example of Dr. Yinsen to inspire his change of heart. Even Maximus had to be reminded by Lucilla of the great man that he once was, the man he could be again. Those supporting characters often do not really have an arc of their own, at least not one that we see unfold on screen. Faye, like Iroh, like Kratos himself, has a past of pain, failure, and loss, but she has, somehow, found the inner strength to forgive herself. That may even be in part due to Kratos' influence. We know from his conversations with Mimir that Kratos is far more willing to extend forgiveness and compassion towards others than he is to himself.
You must live with your deeds, but do not be troubled by them, brother.
Oh? And why not?
You were given an impossible problem. Do not blame yourself for failing to solve it.
And even if Faye found that strength on her own, so what? Is it so bad to have a secondary character be a bastion of wisdom? Don't be turned off by any woman of strong character just because there have been so many poorly written ones. As I will never tire of pointing out, the Captain Marvels and 2020 Mulans of the world are terrible characters because they exist for themselves, because they are there to show the audience how strong, capable, and independent they are. That's not Faye. Faye is there. Faye exists within this story for Kratos. She wants nothing more than for him to be a loving father to Atreus once she is gone. If you look at this example of selfless, self-giving love that a wife has for her husband, and all you see is a woman knowing better than a man, you are once again missing the forest for the trees. The idea that you cannot accept support, encouragement, or advice from the woman in your life, or you lose your man card, is straight up idiotic and shamefully prideful to boot. I'm a big believer in men being the leaders of their families, but that does not mean that any given husband and father has to be an infallible authority figure whose word is the law and whose flaws are never to be noted. Putting yourself on such a pedestal will inevitably lead to failure. Marriage is not a competition or a power struggle. It is, or it is supposed to be, a shared journey. And I know I've already played this clip, but it bears repeating.
We are not our failures. We are not who we were. We must be better.
Faye says we. She says our. Rather than berating Kratos for his lack of self-forgiveness, she binds herself to him, vices, sins, and all. His journey, his struggles, and his battles are hers as well. Her words are not a dismissive admonishment to her husband telling him to stop being such a pig, but rather are an exhortation to him and to herself to constantly strive to grow in virtue, for the sake of each other, for the sake of the son whom they love. There's a distinct difference between the nagging wife who appears to view her husband as barely more than a child whom she needs to shape according to her desires, and the loving wife who sees her spouse as an end in and of himself, as a person worth loving for his own sake. Faye is clearly the latter. But that's enough about Kratos and all his relationship. Let's talk about the man himself. In particular, I want to talk about the desire of many OG Kratos fans, the creator of the character among them, to have Kratos simply continue in his god-slaying ways. Lots of people would have preferred Kratos exercise the nuclear option when facing the Norse gods, rather than temper his murderous rage and choose restraint.
Don't you know what I've done? Yes! But what will you do now?
And hey, if you want that, you want that. I'm not here to tell you that you shouldn't. But let's not pretend that Kratos heedlessly shedding another pantheon's blood would be more masculine than the alternative. If your pinnacle of masculinity is mindless, frenzied violence, then you might want to reevaluate your role models. Doing whatever you want and refusing to take anybody's shit or listen to anybody's advice isn't masculinity. It's childishness. True masculinity is about prudence, wisdom, fortitude, temperance, the control over passions rather than letting them control you, and realizing that your needs and desires are not the ultimate goods in this world. Kratos clearly and obviously grows in masculinity throughout the two Norse games, because he grows in virtue. He comes to accept the truth about who he is and what he has done. He finds within himself forgiveness for his past actions. He resolves to be better than the man he was yesterday. So don't try to tell me that the new game's emasculated Kratos just because he no longer tears gods in half without a second thought. You can't tell me that watching him face down Thor, weaponless, challenging the god of thunder to be better for the sake of his daughter, is less masculine than mindlessly chopping Thor's head off. Okay, but maybe you don't really care about whether or not he is more or less masculine, you just want the ghost of Sparta back. Well, then we enter a more nuanced discussion. We have to answer the question, does this make sense for the character? Because Kratos always was a genuine character with clear and real motivations and objectives. Kratos is not Doom Guy. I enjoy Doom. Killing demons is always good fun, but Doom Guy really is just a machine that inserts lead into hellspawn flesh. From the very beginning of his story, Kratos was clearly more than that. He cared about something. He wanted more out of life than the opportunity to rip apart his enemies, though that desire was, at least for a time, quite high on his wish list. Once his rage had burnt itself out and his enemies, as well as the rest of Greece, lay dead at his feet, Kratos was not simply waiting around patiently for the next chance at violence. His revenge had a purpose, and with it complete, he either took a swan dive off a cliff because he couldn't stand the nightmares, because the memories of his dead wife and daughter could not be erased, or 2 games later, he gave away the power that he had seized, acting in a selfless manner for quite possibly the first time in his life. Point being, this is not a character who you could just reset and have run it back. He had more depth than that. If you wanted to have him shred Asgard with his own 2 hands, you would have had to take the character off the path which God of War 3 started him on. So it's weird to me to hear David Jaffe saying that he doesn't want Kratos to grow, considering that the character did just that even within the first game. At the very least, he changed. He realized that killing Ares could not bring him the peace he desired. It's also strange that Jaffe comments how the core audience of God of War doesn't care about family.
Is your core audience for God of War, I don't think gives a about family in that way or raising a kid.
Bro, the original trilogy came out between 2005 and 2010. Even if a player was only 14 in 2005, that same kid is now 33, and there's a good chance he has kids of his own. Your core audience grows up. Why do you think Toy Story 3 had Andy leave for college in 2010, 15 years after the release of the original movie? Audiences grow up with their franchises. That franchise, 15 years later, can either try to capture a new audience that was more or less the same age as their original audience, or they can try to appeal to their existing fans in their new state of life. People grow up. That usually means they mature too, and thus their tastes change. If it makes sense for the characters, then the story should too. But in fairness to David Jaffe, he does say that he really liked the 2018 game, and that he can admire Ragnarok as an incredibly well-made game and story. It's just not the direction he would have gone with Kratos. And with all due respect to the creator of that character, who really did an excellent job in the early games, I'm glad Santa Monica Studios chose the arc they did. Their games, especially Ragnarok, are hardly perfect. But if there's one thing that our world of entertainment needs, perhaps more than anything right now, it is examples of men who strive tirelessly to grow in virtue, and who fight not for themselves, but for the love of their friends and family.